Our journey back through the 1993 F1 season takes us on to Monaco now, in an era when it wasn't always the awful bore that it is today. And the 1993 edition was particularly eventful, so let's crack on and see if Ayrton Senna could claim his 6th Monaco Grand Prix win. Matt Beer, Ben Anderson and Edd Staw are here with me, Glenn Freeman. Matt, sum this race up for us in no more than 5 words.
Only Schumacher was any good.
Cool, yeah, we'll come back to that. Ben?
Damon's clutch is working fine.
That will soon become very funny. Ed?
It's Larousse's 100th Grand Prix.
Okay. Yeah, very good, very good. Let me check my notes again for those of you listening to every episode of this. Mine is Ferrari. Where have you been? On the grid for this one, Alain Prost claimed his 6th straight pole position of 1993. But for the first time this year, he was joined on the front row by Michael Schumacher's Benetton. Monaco master Ayrton Senna was 3rd, with Damon Hill 4th. The Ferraris of Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger sandwiched Riccardo Patrese Benetton to cover 5th through 7th. And behind them, the inseparable Carl Wendinger and Michael Andretti were next up, of course they were, with Eric Comas completing the top 10 for Larousse. So that's Larousse's 2nd shout-out of this episode already. Prost got away in the lead from pole and led the first 11 laps, but then his race was shattered by a jump start penalty, meaning he was called into the pits to serve a 10-second stop-go. Prost said afterwards that he wasn't sure if he jumped the start. He just thought it was one of the best starts of his career and that Schumacher made a bad start from alongside him, so that exaggerated Prost's launch. He also said he felt 10 seconds was severe for a track like Monaco, where overtaking all the cars he fell behind was going to be so difficult. Ed, you can go first here. Any complaints about Prost getting a penalty? And was 10 seconds too much, like he said?
Well, 10 seconds was about or 10 second stop go was about the going rate there. It's better than some. At Monza in 78, it was 1 minute penalties for jumping the start. So, and actually not as long before that, there were others. Berger had one in Canada, didn't he? So, yeah, I think that's all right. But I love his defence of it. He does what I call a 1980s F1 start, where it's like, this is the best start, one of the best starts I've done. But you do move before it. And a few years later, that will be a clear, no questions jump start. Like today's eyes, it's a jump start by a mile. But it kind of illustrates how things change, because it was in this phase in the mid-90s that we started to get a few more of those picked up, and we then got the sensors in the grid slots a few years later. So the professionalisation of F1 was going on. But yeah, Prost was a little bit retro with his interpretation there. Although I do understand that the stewards weren't absolutely unanimous on it. So there's a bit of argument about whether he should get one or not. So it was still a little bit up in the air.
James Hunt on the commentary talks about the enforcement of jump starts in this era being quite lax, and therefore it's quite harsh. So I think that's quite interesting to juxtapose with what Ed was saying in this and also the previous episode, Spain, about the starts becoming gradually more of a kind of serious policed thing. But even so, I think you have to be a bit extra careful when you're on pole. Like, Prost clearly moves before the lights, and the Lotus team thought that all of the top 4 crept before the lights went out. Well, the lights went green. It's not red lights out in this era, is it? It's red lights out and then green. And Williams were quoted after the race as having no problem with the decision. So it feels like basically Prost stands alone as guy trying to defend the indefensible.
Prost might have thought that being stationary for 10 seconds was too much, but in the end he was sat there for over a minute, as the first 2 times he tried to rejoin the race, he stalled the Williams. He reckoned it was a clutch problem, not for the first time this season, and even when he finally rejoined, it was a very slow, awkward getaway. I mean, he's barely up to speed by the time he's back on the track. Ben, do we give Prost this one? Are we happy to put this down to clutch rather than clutch operator?
No, I'm going to put it down to clutch operator.
Oh,
per my comment at the start about, Damon's is working fine. I mean, maybe Prost could have the worst of the 2 clutches, but I don't think he would do, given he was the Williams team leader. And there is this pattern of Prost struggling to get off the line. We saw it at Imola in the wet. We saw it in Spain. Then he struggles to get out of the pit lane, like you say, after his penalty in Monaco. So he's clearly struggling with it. And I wonder if it's just one of those familiarity things. Like, he's come back to Formula One after a year out. It's a new team, slightly different clutch system, way of operating it. And Damon's obviously spent a few years testing with that team, probably just knows the whole car a bit better, and that explains the difference. That's my best approximation of what's going on there. I feel like there is a pattern, at least, of Prost not really being able to operate it properly, but I don't think there's an obvious technical reason why he should be struggling and he'll not.
Interestingly, this was something I only recently discovered. Apparently, when they stripped back the clutch, when they got it back to the factory, they did find there was some kind of damage at the end of the clutch shaft, which they thought was responsible for that. Which, okay, maybe that's a team protecting its driver or whatever. But I'd have subscribed to the clutch problems being a bit of an excuse. But there is at least a claim from within the team that there was something legitimately wrong there. But yeah, it's a long time ago, so in terms of being absolutely sure, it's quite hard to do. But there's at least some credibility given to what Prost said.
Well, I'll take it all back then.
Well, I was going to say, is it cause or effect though? Was the clutch knackered because some bloke kept trying and failing to get the car back out of the pits, maybe as well?
No, that's a very good question.
Ever fancied owning a piece of one of Ayrton Senna's Formula One cars? Even better, ever fancied owning a piece of one of Ayrton Senna's Formula One cars that you can wear on your wrist? Thanks to Danish specialist watch manufacturer Rek, you can own a timepiece featuring original parts from Senna's 1986 Lotus 98T chassis number 4. Rek Watches spent 2 years working with classic Team Lotus to reforge the original aluminium plenum tubes from the car to form the outer chapter rings for this exclusive watch. The car they used, Chassis 4, was driven by Senna for the last 8 races of the 1986 World Championship, which went to the wire in Australia and ended with Senna's bitter rival Alain Prost champion after an iconic and dramatic puncture for Nigel Mansell's Williams. Senna's car, the last black and gold John Player liveried turbocharged Lotus, is now privately owned and still racing to this day in historic motorsport. Nods to that iconic F1 livery can be seen in the watch's black and gold colour tones and the large number 12 skeletonized on the rotor, while the movement backplate decoration mimics the turbo Renault engine from that car. Because each timepiece uses original materials, the collection is strictly limited to just 989 individually numbered watches, which are exclusively available through rekwatches.com. You currently get a 15% pre-order discount when ordering and an additional 10% discount when using code THERACE, so follow the link in the description and hurry if you want to claim your very own piece of Ayrton Senna's F1 legacy. Prost being taken out of the equation left Schumacher in the lead. Schumacher had been going along nicely with Prost as they both pulled away from Senna in third, and Schumacher was sitting only 2 seconds back from him when Prost came in to serve that penalty. From there, Schumacher had the race under control for the next 20 laps. He extended his lead over Senna to 13 seconds before disaster struck. Schumacher came to a halt at the Lowe's hairpin, having suffered a hydraulic failure, and when his car stopped, it caught fire. Schumacher said his emotions were conflicted afterwards, as while he was disappointed to retire, he was pleased to run Prost so closely and to have Senna's McLaren covered, which he felt showed Benetton was making real progress. Matt, a front row start and they're leading comfortably. What did you make of Schumacher's performance across the whole weekend here in Monaco?
Absolutely brilliant, and even more so because I hadn't remembered anything about 93, particularly before this. I had like vague things. Watching the races years ago, but I was like, to do this season properly, I need to experience as much of it as if it's the first time as possible. And through the opening rounds, I was going, hang on, when is Schumacher going to do something good? This guy dominates.
We barely
F1.
talked about him up to this point.
And like, I think because you've got a few iconic races early on, like Brazil and Donington, and Senna's getting all the plaudits there. Things aren't working out for Schumacher, but he's not looking that impressive relatively either here, in a car that, from everything I've read, I don't believe was as sweet handling as the McLaren, even though obviously McLaren felt had the power advantage. Don't need that in Monaco. He's got Senna covered. He's up with Prost. He looks phenomenally good. It's a proper window on what was to come, but the fact we hadn't really noticed him until this point, properly in this season, it does make you kind of realise when Schumacher was dominating F1 just over a year later, why F1 was panicking, going, we just got to rely on this guy? Do we for like a following and to get any attention with Senna, Prost and Mansell all not there anymore for different reasons? I can understand why a Schumacher dominated F1 seems really jarring, because there hadn't been enough evidence often enough that he was going to become the superstar he was. But a day like this really was evidence of that. It was superb.
Didn't get the feeling from watching the early races that he'd been totally out of the picture. He's always kind of at the back of the leading group, isn't he? He's kind of sniping behind the two Williams and the McLaren if they're in the race. And I feel like this one, he comes alive because, well, A, he's good at Monaco and went on to be amazing at Monaco. So there's that element of, the good drivers stand out, certainly in this era. But also the Benetton's got the traction control, finally. So it's kind of like the Benetton becomes the car it should have been from the start of the season, but it couldn't be because Ford were just being dicks about having the traction control system on the car. So they finally get it, and then Schumacher just takes the step forward that he should have taken from the start of the season. And you can see from, the world's most washed Formula One driver at this point, Patrese, being quite competitive for the second race weekend in a row, that the car is just globally better, and that puts Schumacher in the fight rather than kind of hanging off the back of it.
There's an interesting thing that Schumacher said that weekend, that he tried turning the traction control on and off, and he reckoned it was worth 1.2 seconds a lap, and even allowing for probably some exaggeration there, or overestimation rather than exaggeration. That does tell you how valuable it was. And of course, it was Ford that prevented them from using their system, because McLaren had this slightly savage cylinder cut, whereas the Benetton one was a throttle intervention system, as it was referred to. So a big amount of performance there, and it was such a shame that this race didn't go the way that it should have done, because I remember that's one of my standout memories of the season, actually being gutted when Schumacher retired, because I hadn't quite moved on to being much of a Hill fan at this stage, but Schumacher was the driver I was really enjoying.
Schumacher's retirement left Senna with a big lead over Hill, who spent most of this race being hassled by, I can't believe I'm about to say this given how their year has gone so far, hassled by the Ferraris. Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger spent most of the first half of the race right on Hill's tail, moving up the points places to run third and fourth as Prost and Schumacher fell by the wayside. Damon finally pulled a bit of a gap on them when Alesi's pace started to drop around lap 30, and eventually Berger decided to bail out for a fresh set of tyres as he was stuck behind Alesi. There's more to come on Ferrari here in a moment, but Ed, firstly, where did this reasonable, respectable pace come from? We talked about Benetton and Schumacher maybe being a bit anonymous up to this point. Ferrari had been completely nowhere before this weekend.
Yeah, I think they were certainly helped by being on a track where aero wasn't so important, because the car wasn't very good. It was kind of it was envisaged originally as a bit of an interim car before the proper John Barnard car. Of course, John Barnard had came in mid-season, but they decided against that because of the electronic aids ban coming in for the next year. And so the first full-blown Barnard car for his second stint was the 94 car. So it wasn't good aero-wise. The active suspension was all over the place, and in Spain had all sorts of problems. So I think basically it was a track where the drivers could make a bit of a difference, and while Alesi and Berger have their weaknesses, shall we say, they could also be pretty quick. And I think it was just a case of leaning more on the mechanical platform, not needing so much aero. They could drive around some of the problems, or some of the problems that made the car rubbish elsewhere work reasonably well for them. And that was reflected in being a little bit more credible. But even so, the fact that this is considered a great performance, an outlier performance for Ferrari, tells you a lot about them, because it's not that they were threatening for race victory, was it?
I think there were two aspects to the Ferrari being just relatively better here than it looked before. If I'm right, they were working on a new engine, so the engine wasn't great at the start of the season. And obviously, the power element wasn't so important. That's why everyone was talking up McLaren's chances and Senna's chances in particular ahead of this race. But also on the active suspension side, I mean, Ed mentioned it in previous shows, they were literally bouncing between different versions of the active suspension and trying different ones and not really getting
Still were this weekend as well. Berger was switching in practice to running some conventional springs, and also there's all sorts of stuff going on. And incidentally, on your engine point, Larini around this time was out testing a full valve version of the engine that came in later in the year. So yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, I thought our resident 93 Anorak Ed would be able to provide extra detail on these points. But if I'm right, this weekend Ferrari settled on the spring-operated version of the active suspension rather than the gas-operated version that they decided was the most problematic, and that seemed to settle the car down and make it at least predictable enough for two pretty experienced by this point drivers to make a reasonable fist of the race.
Berger's tyre advantage after that pit stop meant he quickly caught Alesi back up. By lap 60, Alesi had fallen 15 seconds behind Hill. Berger then put a brilliant pass on Alesi at the Lowe's hairpin for third and charged after Hill, who was losing time among the backmarkers. It only took Berger a handful of laps to catch Damon, and when he got there, he tried to repeat the pass he'd made on Alesi at the hairpin, but he smashed into the side pod of the Williams, breaking his own suspension in the process. So Berger was out, and after a long delay, Hill was able to, I think it was a 3-point turn, to get himself back in the race just ahead of Alesi, who is now back up to third. Ben, we should get your Damon Hill's perspective on this first. What did you make of Berger's move here?
Over optimistic, I think. I can see why he tried it, because he pulled off the Alesi one with kind of brakes locking and whatnot. But obviously had the tyre advantage. He had a compliant teammate that kind of doesn't make it too difficult for him, and he's closer as well when he pulls off the Alesi pass. I think he just thinks, I can surprise Damon and just repeat the thing I've just done, but the Williams is too far ahead. It's a Williams and not a Ferrari that he's trying to pass, and he just misjudges it, locks up and clatters into him. I think there's a good bit of natural justice there, that the track's blocked and that therefore allows Damon to do his turn and escape without basically any punishment.
It's an awful move in the sense that it has no chance of working, but I totally see why he went for it, and I actually almost don't think he should have done anything different, because he's caught Hill. He's taken 16 seconds out of Hill in 6 or 7 laps. I know he's got the tyre advantage, but that's a Ferrari versus a Williams in 93. Okay, Hill's in traffic. My old friend Alex Zanardi is like wombling around the track being particularly obstructive again. Sorry about that. But he's demolished that Williams. There's only 7 or 8 laps left in the race. How many chances in a Ferrari in 93 are you going to get to pass the Williams? He had to go for it. It had to be something surprising and weird to have any hope. Obviously, it was atrocious, but what else could he do? Just go, okay, I'm going to settle in behind this car because my car's inferior. Go for it. Damon might have been scared out of the way.
Weirdly, it's the kind of move you'd expect from a Lacey, not Berger. That's the thing that I find surprising about it.
Yeah, I think Berger was definitely willing to risk his race for that move, and definitely willing to risk Damon Hill's race for it as well, given there was no championship concerns or anything. But it's an interesting illustration, this race, actually, of how undeveloped tyre strategy was, because that was a really quick approach, and there was talk before the race about the need for a pit stop, because Monaco was kind of considered a no pit stop race, but I think there's only one compounded tyre available. I think they're all Goodyear C's, and there was a bit of a question mark about it. So actually the quickest way to do the race was to take a tyre change. I think Ferrari only took it because Berger could take a free stop, basically. He was fourth, he came out fourth, so he lost time, but it's just, well, we can just do that and go forward. So it's an interesting example of how fly by night the tyre strategies actually were, because you would have a quicker race time by making a tyre stop in that race, provided you could find a gap to drop into.
Well, it was more fun that way, wasn't it? You kind of wait for a guy to... His race situation got to the point where he either goes, I'm stuck, I might as well take some tyres, or there's no one behind me, I might as well take some tyres, or there's no way I can do anything about this car in front, or it was always... A tyre stop was always reactionary, wasn't it, rather than planned. And that made it much more exciting. That's how, in the old days, you got these races where someone would put fresh tyres on and then charge back, and it often wouldn't cross the mind of the car ahead to try to cover the pit stop. They're too good at their jobs now. There's too many strategists, and it's all just done too well today. So yeah, a good thing to highlight there, Ed. The clash with Berger cost Hill 22 seconds, so Senna's lead ballooned to 49 seconds. And from there, he was able to cruise home to claim his 6th Monaco win and his 5th in a row. He also retook the lead of the championship by 5 points over Prost. We'll come back to Prost's recovery shortly. But Ed, was this the least impressive of Senna's brilliant Monaco wins? I know to finish first you have to finish, but he didn't seem to have any pace compared to Prost or Schumacher before their races fell apart, and then this win just kind of fell into his lap.
Yeah, I think it was the least impressive, and Senna himself said he was only really at 99% because he'd had that big crash on Thursday, going down towards the first corner.
Only 99%.
Yeah, exactly. Senna at 99%, still very quick, but he'd either hit a bump or there'd been some kind of ride height issue, because there was some work going on with their ride height adjuster, a driver adjustable thing for, like Williams had, to get the low drag configuration on the straight. So there may even have been a setting mistake, or he hadn't reset it, or something that had contributed to that. And he had an off as well on the bumps at the chicane later in the weekend as well. Plus he'd hurt his left hand as well. His left thumb, I think, was injured in that Thursday crash. In fact, he said if he wasn't in a semi-auto car, he'd have probably struggled to race, not because that was his gear shift hand, but because that was his steer while you are shifting gear hand, as it were. So there were reasons why Senna was not at his best, and he knew it on the week. He said on the weekend, I've not really been quite there, and that's why in that regard it was probably the least impressive. Although you could flip it and say, well, it was a victory in adversity, but equally he's not winning that race if Prost doesn't get the penalty. He's not winning that race if Schumacher doesn't have the hydraulic failure. So yeah, I mean, he's got 6 Monaco wins. He can have one that's a tiny bit less impressive than the others. I think we'll allow him that.
You get the sense from what Senna was saying that he genuinely scared himself on this weekend. Like the practice crash, as Ed said, he admitted to not being at 100%, but he also said that he felt sure he was going to lose his legs in that practice crash at Saint-Devote. And the way he drives, he just looks like someone who's a bit like, I don't trust myself or this car on this circuit. And obviously Monaco is all about confidence and trust in the machinery under you, because there's no margin for error. And he just looks like a guy who's leaving way too much margin. And he just gets away with it because of the circumstances of Prost's dodgy clutch or dodgy operation of the clutch, and the really quick Benetton not being reliable enough.
I think there was definitely some concern about what was going on with the active ride there and sort of disconnecting front and rear. So I wonder if that was part of it, because we often talk about how the active suspension system reduces the amount of feel you've got. So you can see why, if you have had your confidence dented by some offs, that you might struggle a little bit to just go to that limit that you know is there but you can't feel. But it may also have been that he just wasn't trusting it quite as much as he should have done, and that just knocked that little bit of an edge off his driving. Or it could just be that obviously the Williams, he had no reason to be beating a Williams, did he, there in terms of pace, because the Williams was better even around there, and the improved Benetton, perhaps the Benetton was just a quicker car. So I'm certainly not saying this was a bad victory for Senna, but yeah, everything he said, as you said, Ben, indicates Senna did not feel he was quite 100% of the races by his lofty standards.
Yeah, I can use the line that I usually have to use in defence of Jacques Villeneuve's World Championship in 1997, where I say, ultimately, they put your name in the trophy and there's no room for small print. So, Senna's got 6 wins and nobody ever goes, yeah, but 93 wasn't very good, was it? He's just the master of Monaco. I said we'd come back to Prost, so let's do that now. His penalty and all the stalling dramas dropped into 22nd place, but by the end, he was back up to 4th, salvaging 3 points to limit the damage Senna was able to do in the championship. Prost was a lap down, while the other 2 points finishers, Christian Fittipaldi's Minardi and Martin Brundle's Ligier, were 2 laps down on Senna. Matt, what did you make of Prost's recovery? Was 22nd to 4th a good fight back?
Yeah, genuinely good. Okay, there's caveats. He's in a Williams, so he's literally qualified 6 seconds faster than some of the people he was passing, but not all of them, by a long way. He's got the traction. He's got much better traction control system than half the people he's passing, if they've got traction control at all. Okay, big advantage. He's got more power. All these things. Yes, he should be making ground. However, it's still Monaco. It's still Alain Prost at this end of his career, where you don't really expect him to be coming back through the field. If you're going to put yourself a lapped 22nd in Monaco after 13 laps because you can't start your damn car, then at least maximise what you get after that. And he passed everyone he had a realistic chance of passing and getting back in front of. The ones he didn't catch were impossible to catch given what a disadvantage he'd put himself at. He maximised what he could do. It's still a tricky circuit to pass, even with those advantages, even in 1993. Very decent effort, a little bit out of the stereotype for Prost in 93 to actually put on that much of a charge to recover.
I feel like maybe this is uncharitable, but they don't make it difficult for him. I wonder if they just feel like he should be lapping them, because there's so much of Prost just sails past a guy who, if this was Monaco even 10 years after 93, never mind modern day Monaco, he would be having to fight for every scrap of position he could possibly get against those rubbish cars, because you just sit there and park it. But I feel like they just see, oh, it's a Williams in my mirror, there you go, mate, I'm not racing you, and he just kind of ninjas his way up to fourth place.
You're right. I'm certain that probably half the people he passed were convinced they were being lapped. But even then, like everyone, Damon couldn't lap people. You know, he lost all that time to useless Ferraris because he couldn't actually lap cars. So even if Prost was still doing better on that front.
It's interesting if you look at the pace of Prost as well. His race. Pace compared to Senna's pretty good, which when you consider he's in traffic and that kind of thing, suggests he's driving well. It's really hard to tell because you can look at the lap times, but there's very little footage of what Prost was doing. You see him every now and again. There's a bit after his penalty where he sat behind Matt Beer's favourite Alex Zanardi for a bit. So
of course,
I think all things considered, it was a pretty good effort to salvage that from Prost, and I suspect he was a bit annoyed about the jump start penalty as well. So maybe that sort of woke him up and prevented him from getting Benaldi at any stage. But we sort of joke about Prost coasting to the championship and doing the minimum in 93, and over the whole part of the season, I think that's a fair conclusion. But there are points where he cracks on. He could easily have just sort of almost given up at Monaco, and he didn't. He cracked on, came back to a good position at a track where it's difficult to do that. So there's lots of times in 93 where his class does shine through, and I think this is probably one of them, even though he largely does it sight unseen.
So as I mentioned earlier, Senna was back in the lead of the championship with his third win of the season, taking him to 42 points, with Prost second on 37. Hill moved back ahead of Schumacher with 18 points to Schumacher's 14, and everybody else was miles behind by this point. If you're watching this on YouTube, this is usually a members-only series. We're doing the whole 93 season in this style, alongside all of our other Bring Back V10's bonus content and loads of bonus content from our F1 team that's travelling to all the races on the road in the present day as well. So it's not just classic F1 content. If you want to come and check us out on Patreon, there's a link in the description and a pinned comment under this video to come and see more of the things you've been missing out on. We'd love to have you along with us.